Do you believe in forgiving or forgetting?
I remember sitting in my parents' kitchen one afternoon, staring at a pile of mail I had been meaning to sort for days, and I realized that something had always felt off about the way they talked about my future. The way they promised me that every penny they saved was for my education, for my chance to get out, to succeed, to have opportunities they never had, and at the time I didn't question it because it made sense. They said it so convincingly, and I trusted them without hesitation, but that day I saw the first crack, and it started with something so small, so ordinary, that I almost laughed at myself for not noticing sooner, because it was just a bank statement slipped under a pile of bills. The numbers barely visible, but enough to make my stomach drop the second I realized that the savings account my parents kept talking about as my future fund had barely enough to cover my first semester, while the rest of it seemed to have disappeared into thin air, and that's when I started asking questions, because I had always been the good kid, the one who followed the rules, who did her homework without complaint, who waited patiently for the reward my parents promised, and yet here I was, facing evidence that maybe those promises were not what they seemed. It began slowly, with casual questions at the dinner table about tuition, about scholarships, about my brother Jason and his education, and each time I asked, the answers felt rehearsed, the smiles a little too tight, the explanations too neat to feel real. Until finally one evening, after I had exhausted all polite attempts to understand why my college payments were a mess while Jason's new textbooks and tutoring sessions seemed endless, I asked my mother directly, in a voice I didn't fully recognize as my own because it carried anger I had been holding back for years, and she looked at me with that expression she always used when she wanted to make me feel guilty for thinking badly of them, the one that said I was being ungrateful and dramatic. And she told me that of course they had been saving for me, that everything they had done was for my benefit, that I was misunderstanding things, and for a moment I wanted to believe her. I wanted to accept that maybe it was just a complicated financial juggling act, but the seed of doubt had been planted, and I couldn't ignore it anymore. The next step came when I started talking to people outside the house, the ones who had no reason to lie or spare my feelings, and that's when it got worse, because a friend of mine, someone who knew both me and Jason, casually mentioned that Jason's college had just received another installment from my parents, more than enough to cover his tuition for the semester, and I remember sitting on my bed, holding my phone in my hand, staring at the message, my heart sinking because it hit me all at once that everything I had believed about their sacrifices for my future had been a lie, that the money that should have been mine, the money that I had trusted would be there, had gone straight to my brother, to give him an advantage I never received. And it wasn't a small amount, it was enough that I could have avoided student loans, enough that I could have focused entirely on my studies instead of splitting my time between classes and part-time jobs just to make ends meet, and suddenly all those years of hearing them talk about your future felt like a cruel joke, like I had been a pawn in a game I didn't even know I was playing. I confronted them one night after dinner, and I can still hear the sound of my own voice, shaking but firm, demanding to know why every cent had gone to Jason, why they had let me struggle, why they had made me believe that sacrifices were being made for me when they were being made for him, and the look on their faces was exactly what I had expected. That mixture of irritation and guilt that people use when they don't want to answer questions, but know they can't lie outright, and my father finally said, in a tone that was meant to sound reasonable but came across as cold and calculated, that Jason needed the help, that he had bigger ambitions, that I would understand when I got older, and I felt my chest tighten because the words were hollow. Because I had spent years putting my life on hold, because I had worked so hard, played by all the rules, and none of it had been valued or acknowledged, and for the first time I felt a surge of anger so strong it was almost physical. Because it wasn't just disappointment I was feeling, it was betrayal, and I realized that nothing they said about my future had ever been real, and they had never truly seen me as an equal. That night I went to my room and sat on the floor, the statement from my bank in one hand, my phone in the other, and I started thinking about what I could do, because for the first time, I understood that waiting, trusting, hoping, and obeying was not going to get me anywhere. that the only thing I could rely on was myself, and I made a decision that felt both terrifying and liberating at the same time, that I would no longer depend on them. That I would figure out a way to pay for the rest of my education on my own, and that I would make sure that when I graduated, when I finally walked across that stage with my degree in hand, they would not be able to take credit for it, they would not be able to benefit from it. And Jason would not be handed any of the advantages that I had worked for so hard while they had ignored my needs. By the time I fell asleep that night, the seed of my plan had been planted, quiet and unassuming, but powerful, and I could feel it growing inside me, because I had been underestimated for years, because they had assumed that I would never question them, and because they had believed that I would always take what they gave me without looking closer, and now, finally, I was awake, aware, and ready to take control, even if it meant leaving my family behind, even if it meant proving them wrong in the only way that mattered, which was by showing that I could succeed completely on my own, and the truth was that I didn't know yet exactly how I was going to do it, but I knew one thing for certain, that I would, and that they would never see it coming. And that was when I realized that this was not just about money, it was about respect, it was about recognition. It was about finally turning the tables on the people who had claimed to love me, but had spent years undermining me without ever saying it aloud. And even though it hurt like hell, I felt the first taste of empowerment in my life. A quiet thrill that whispered that everything I had ever believed about fairness and family was a lie, and that I was about to prove it in the most satisfying way possible. And the next day I started making the moves that would eventually ensure that I graduated not just alone, but untouchable, financially independent, and capable of finally taking the revenge that I had been dreaming of ever since I realized that nothing from them would ever come to me unless I made it happen myself. And the thought of it made me smile, because for the first time in years, I felt like I was actually winning. After the realization hit me that every cent my parents had claimed to be saving for me had instead been funneled into Jason's education, I quickly understood that sitting around and feeling betrayed would get me nowhere. And so I made the conscious decision that from that moment forward, I would rely entirely on myself, even though the idea of navigating college without their financial support filled me with anxiety I had never known before. Because I had always assumed that my parents' promises were real and that I would be able to focus solely on studying without the constant worry of tuition, housing, or living expenses, and that assumption had been the foundation of my entire plan for the future, a plan that had now been stripped away, leaving me to scramble for a way to continue my education while maintaining some semblance of stability. I started by taking stock of what I had and what I could realistically manage, realizing that I would need to work multiple jobs if I wanted to avoid drowning in debt, and that each hour I spent at a part-time job would be time taken away from studying. But I couldn't afford to let that stop me because I knew that failing now would mean confirming the very thing my parents seemed to believe, which was that I was incapable of making it on my own, and I refused to let them have that satisfaction. So I began picking up shifts wherever I could, from waiting tables at a small diner to tutoring younger students in subjects I excelled in, and even though the work was exhausting and left me with barely any free time, I discovered something I hadn't expected, which was a sense of independence I had never felt before, a kind of pride in knowing that every dollar I earned was a result of my own efforts, and not someone else's promises. At the same time, I poured myself into my studies more intensely than ever, because I understood that my success would not just be measured in dollars saved, but in achievements earned and recognized by others who didn't have a reason to favor Jason or dismiss my hard work. And so I applied for every scholarship I could find, wrote essays that bled my determination onto the page, and sought out professors who could offer guidance and recommendation letters, knowing that their support would be more genuine and more valuable than the hollow assurances of my family. And slowly but surely, I began to see the results of my efforts when I was awarded a scholarship that covered part of my tuition, an amount that my parents had promised but never delivered, and for the first time in years, I felt that surge of validation that comes from knowing you are capable of succeeding entirely on your own terms. Despite the growing relief that came with these small victories, the emotional toll of realizing that my parents had actively chosen Jason over me did not fade, and I noticed it in the way I spoke to them during our occasional calls. In the way I measured my words carefully to hide my anger, in the way I refused to brag about achievements because I knew they would downplay them or compare them to Jason's supposed accomplishments, and I watched Jason with a mix of amusement and irritation as he floated through life assuming that the support my parents gave him was his by default, oblivious to the fact that the same resources had been promised to me and deliberately withheld, and every time he complained about something he deemed unfair, I felt a surge of frustration because I knew that my struggles were invisible, my sacrifices unacknowledged, and yet I continued to work and study and plan because I was not willing to let anyone, not even my own family, define the value of my efforts. By the middle of that year, I had become adept at balancing work and school in a way that I would not have imagined possible before, and it was in those long, exhausting nights of studying after double shifts that I realized the depth of my resilience. Because I was accomplishing more than Jason ever had, while simultaneously managing every aspect of my life that my parents had neglected to support, and I began quietly documenting everything, every expense they had claimed was for me, every scholarship I applied for, every opportunity they had denied me, not out of obsession, but because I understood that knowledge was power, and in this case, understanding the full scope of their favoritism and the way they had treated me unfairly would give me the leverage I needed to ensure that when the time came, I would not just graduate. I would graduate in a way that would make them realize the consequences of their choices without me ever having to stoop to their level. It was during this period that I also realized something equally important, which was that I had the chance to build a network independent of my family, to cultivate relationships with people who recognized talent and hard work, who did not measure my worth by comparisons to a sibling, and who could open doors that my parents had long since closed to me, and so I threw myself into these relationships with a determination that bordered on obsession, attending every networking event I could, seeking mentorship and learning to navigate the professional world with a skill that Jason, with all the support he had been given, lacked entirely, and it was empowering in a way that I had never imagined. Because I knew that every accomplishment I achieved was mine alone, earned without the cushion of parental favoritism, and that thought gave me the fuel I needed to continue pushing through exhaustion. To continue sacrificing social life and comfort for the future I refused to let them steal from me again. And by the end of that semester, as I looked over the small stack of checks and letters that represented my independence and my success, I felt a complicated mixture of pride, rage, and satisfaction because I had proven to myself that I could thrive without their support, that I could excel while Jason relied on everything being handed to him, and that I had begun constructing a quiet plan to ensure that when I finally graduated, I would do so on my terms, in my way, and with a final act that would leave no question in anyone's mind about who had truly earned what, and as I counted the last check from a scholarship that I had fought tooth and nail to receive, I smiled quietly to myself, knowing that the next time my parents and Jason thought they could control the narrative of my life, they would be in for a surprise, and the sense of power and anticipation coursing through me was intoxicating because for the first time, I felt not just independent, but untouchable, and I knew that. Every step I had taken while they slept through my struggles was bringing me closer to the moment when I would reclaim everything they had stolen, and in a way they would never expect. By the time I reached my junior year, I had learned to navigate life entirely on my own terms. But what I realized with increasing clarity was that simply surviving while Jason floated through life on the safety net my parents had so conveniently provided was not enough. Because there was a deeper satisfaction to be found in making them finally understand the consequences of their favoritism and the mistakes they had made by underestimating me, and so I began to develop a plan, not a reckless one, but a calculated strategy that relied on patience, observation, and the careful leveraging of every resource I had earned, every relationship I had nurtured, and every ounce of independence I had painstakingly built over the previous years, all while maintaining the appearance of being the polite, obedient daughter who had suffered in silence. I started by quietly documenting every interaction I had with my parents and Jason, noting the subtle ways in which my achievements were dismissed and how their energy was always funneled into Jason. From the vacations they insisted he take to the extracurriculars they funded without a second thought for my participation, and I kept copies of emails, scholarship letters, job offers, and even text messages that proved I had been systematically denied opportunities they claimed were unavailable. Because I knew that in the end, evidence would speak louder than accusations, and when the time came, it would give me the leverage I needed to act decisively, not just for revenge, but to assert the value of my own hard work in a way that no one could refute. Simultaneously, I began strengthening the network of people who could support me independently of my family, cultivating friendships and professional relationships that extended beyond the classroom and part-time jobs. And I realized that the more allies I had who genuinely respected my abilities, the more insulated I would be from my parents' attempts to undermine me, because I understood that power in life was rarely just about money or education, but about who recognized your worth and who could open doors that your adversaries assumed were closed. And every time I gained a new mentor, an internship opportunity, or even a casual connection with someone influential, I felt the invisible shift happening. The subtle tilting of the balance in my favor, because I was no longer waiting for my parents' approval or investment to define my future. During this period, I also began experimenting with small, controlled ways to assert independence within my family without triggering a confrontation that might jeopardize my position, such as enrolling in classes that Jason had been offered the chance to attend but had rejected, taking on internships that my parents assumed I couldn't manage without their support, and even negotiating small personal victories like attending events that were technically off-limits according to their rules, all of which served a dual purpose. They reinforced my own confidence and competence, and they subtly challenged the narrative that they had built around Jason being the favored child, and I could see the small cracks forming in their assumptions, even if they didn't realize it yet, because every decision I made with deliberate intelligence was quietly undermining the story they had constructed about who deserved opportunity and recognition. While I was doing this, I also maintained the outward appearance of politeness and compliance, never confronting them directly, never allowing my growing anger and sense of injustice to seep into visible conflict, because I understood that a direct challenge too early would likely provoke defensiveness, manipulation, or even sabotage, and none of that would serve my ultimate goal, which was not just to survive, but to thrive in a way that would be undeniably mine. A victory so complete that it could not be explained away as luck or circumstance, and it was this understanding that guided every decision I made, from the way I spent my evenings budgeting my time between work and study, to the subtle ways I referenced Jason's achievements in conversation without giving my parents the satisfaction of knowing I saw through the illusion, all while quietly plotting the final moves of a strategy that had been years in the making. By mid-year, the small victories I had accumulated began to compound in ways that even I could not have fully predicted, because professors were taking notice, employers were recognizing the quality of my work, and opportunities that had once seemed distant suddenly became tangible, and in every moment, I felt the anticipation building, knowing that I had positioned myself in a place where, once I graduated, the leverage I held would be absolute. Because I was not just financially independent. I was strategically powerful in a network of influence that my parents had entirely overlooked, and I could see the endgame forming clearly in my mind, a scenario in which every bit of effort, every sacrifice, every sleepless night and double shift would culminate in a final revelation that would leave them stunned and powerless. And even as I continued to push through exhaustion and self-doubt, I began planting the seeds of what would become the ultimate act of satisfaction, arranging my finances, my achievements, and my documentation so that by the time graduation arrived, it would not just be a symbolic victory, but a tangible one, a moment in which the choices my parents had made, the favoritism they had shown, and the resources they had misallocated would all be rendered irrelevant in the face of the undeniable fact that I had succeeded entirely on my own, and I could see the looks on their faces even before it happened, a mixture of shock, regret, and disbelief that the child they had ignored had been quietly constructing a future that they could no longer control. And that realization, more than anything, made the sacrifices worth it because it confirmed that I had not only survived, but outmaneuvered the people who had underestimated me for years. Every decision I made from that point onward was filtered through the lens of the final reveal, every action a step closer to the moment where my triumph would be complete and undeniable, and even Jason's casual arrogance became an asset, because it would make his eventual shock and my parents' realization all the more acute, and I understood with a sense of cold satisfaction that the combination of patience, strategy, and relentless effort would ensure that when the day finally came, I would not just graduate, I would do so with the quiet, devastating proof that every cent they had spent on him at my expense had been wasted in comparison to what I had earned with my own hands, and in that knowledge I found a calm, ruthless confidence that nothing could shake, a certainty that the ultimate act of revenge would be as satisfying as it was inevitable. By the time my final year arrived, I had carefully built a life that was entirely independent of my parents, but I understood that independence alone would not deliver the satisfaction I craved, because while I had proven to myself that I could thrive without their support, the people who had betrayed me, my parents and Jason, still existed in the same house, still assumed control over the narrative of our family, and still believed that their favoritism and financial manipulation were invisible or inconsequential, and so I realized that the next step had to be strategic, deliberate, and visible in a way that would be impossible for them to ignore, and the challenge became not simply surviving or excelling, but demonstrating through tangible, undeniable evidence that their assumptions about my abilities, ambition, and resilience were catastrophically wrong, and that the years they had invested solely in Jason had been a waste in terms of shaping the child who would ultimately claim the victory. I started by consolidating the achievements that had gone unnoticed for years, carefully organizing scholarship letters, internship offers, awards, and job prospects into a clear narrative that showed my relentless pursuit of education and career development without a single cent of their support. And I began finding subtle ways to integrate these accomplishments into family interactions without appearing overtly confrontational, such as casually mentioning an award I had received while we discussed Jason's recent grades, or describing the internship that had led to a paid project without any financial assistance from them, and with each small revelation, I could feel the cracks forming in the facade of their assumed superiority, because they had never expected me to develop influence, recognition, or tangible opportunities without their control, and their disbelief was a silent confirmation that my careful planning was working exactly as intended. At the same time, I strategically leveraged my growing independence to build external credibility that my family could not dispute, securing internships that gave me professional connections and references, and taking on responsibilities that Jason had never been capable of managing on his own, all while maintaining the appearance of being polite, compliant, and unobtrusive during family gatherings. And it was in this dual existence that I found the perfect balance between demonstrating competence to the outside world and preparing the stage for a final revelation that would leave my parents and Jason stunned, because they had assumed that their investment in Jason guaranteed success, while every day I silently accrued proof that the real success was mine, earned through persistence, sacrifice, and calculated intelligence. One particularly satisfying moment came when I secured an internship at a highly competitive company, a position that Jason had been encouraged to apply for but had declined because it required too much effort. And as I navigated that opportunity, receiving praise from supervisors and respect from peers, I understood that this was more than just professional development. It was a tool, a way to show, subtly but unmistakably, that while Jason had been the focus of parental resources, I had been quietly constructing a future that would surpass any advantage he had ever been given, and the thought of their eventual shock was energizing because it confirmed that my strategy of patience, diligence, and visible, undeniable achievement was unfolding exactly as I had envisioned over the past several years. Simultaneously, I began planting the seeds for the ultimate revelation, creating circumstances where my accomplishments would become impossible to ignore. such as organizing my graduation ceremony to include recognition of scholarships and awards that my parents had been told I was ineligible for, and inviting a select group of mentors, professors, and professional contacts who had witnessed my relentless efforts and could silently corroborate my achievements, because I understood that a victory without witnesses, without the silent acknowledgement of those who had seen my work firsthand, would feel incomplete. And the anticipation of watching the moment when my parents and Jason would finally realize that their investment had been misallocated fueled my focus and determination, making the long hours and sacrifices feel not just necessary, but essential to the final execution of my plan. At home, I navigated interactions with careful precision, choosing words and stories that emphasized confidence and initiative while leaving just enough ambiguity to provoke curiosity and unease. Because I wanted my parents to begin questioning the narrative they had believed about Jason's success and to recognize the growing reality that my life was moving forward with or without their approval, and I could see the subtle shifts in their behavior. The barely noticeable pause when I mentioned a project I had led successfully, the slight tension in conversations about Jason's grades, the invisible recognition that they could no longer fully control the story of who was succeeding, and it was in those small, almost imperceptible moments that I realized my plan was entering the final phase, a phase in which patience, strategy, and relentless self-sufficiency would converge to deliver a revelation that would be emotionally and practically undeniable. The culmination of these efforts began to form in my mind as a sequence that required careful timing and precision, because I could not afford missteps, and so I synchronized scholarship announcements, project completions, and family gatherings in a way that would maximize the impact of the eventual revelation, ensuring that every detail of my success would be publicly, verifiably, and incontrovertibly mine. And the knowledge that my parents and Jason were completely unaware of the full scope of my achievements made every hour of planning feel worth it, because I understood that when the time came, they would not just witness my success, they would be forced to confront their own choices, their own favoritism, and the reality that their assumptions had led them to invest in the wrong child, and that the victory I was constructing was both inevitable and absolute. By the end of that year, as I reviewed every element of my plan, from the documentation of my independent accomplishments to the subtle social positioning that ensured maximum impact, I felt a sense of controlled excitement. Because the moment of revelation was near, and I knew that when I walked across the stage at graduation, every detail would speak louder than any argument or confrontation ever could, and in that realization, I understood the final truth that had been driving me all these years. I had built a life and a future that belonged entirely to me, and the satisfaction of knowing that it would finally be recognized, and that the people who had tried to control or undermine me would be forced to acknowledge it, was more powerful than any revenge I could have imagined, because it was complete, inarguable, and brilliantly executed. The day of graduation arrived after years of careful planning, calculated sacrifices, and relentless effort, and even as I walked through the campus feeling the weight of every sleepless night, every job I had taken to pay for tuition, and every moment I had spent quietly building a life independent of my parents' resources, I was acutely aware that this day was not just about a diploma, it was about delivering a truth they had stubbornly refused to see, because for years I had been painted as the overlooked child, the one whose ambitions were minimized while every resource, every opportunity, and every cent of supposed family investment had been funneled toward Jason, and I understood in that moment that my success would not merely be symbolic. It would be tangible, undeniable, and impossible for them to misinterpret, and that knowledge gave me a quiet, almost ruthless sense of anticipation as I prepared to step into the culmination of a plan I had been constructing since the first time I realized my parents' priorities had nothing to do with fairness or my future. From the moment I entered the auditorium, I noticed the way my parents had arranged themselves, sitting together with Jason between them, a display that screamed pride in him, certainty in his superiority, and obliviousness to the quiet storm that had been growing under their noses, and I allowed myself the briefest flicker of satisfaction as I recognized that they had no idea just how prepared I was. How carefully I had orchestrated every detail of this moment, and how devastatingly clear the contrast between our respective achievements would be, because I had arranged for the announcements of scholarships, awards, and recognitions I had earned without their assistance to be prominently featured, and I had invited mentors, colleagues, and friends who could witness and validate every accomplishment, creating a network of acknowledgement that my parents could not deny or dismiss without revealing their own blindness and favoritism, and in that realization I felt a surge of controlled excitement, knowing that the culmination of years of effort and planning was about to unfold in front of the very people who had doubted and undermined me. As the ceremony progressed, I could feel the tension building, not because of nerves over walking across the stage, but because I understood that each step I took, each piece of evidence of my competence and independence, was being observed by those who had assumed control over my life, and I relished the subtle shifts in their expressions when they noticed the details I had meticulously aligned to ensure maximum impact, because for years they had dismissed me, overlooked me, and invested in Jason with complete confidence that his success was guaranteed by their favoritism, and now, each recognition I received, each name announced, each accolade displayed, revealed not only my achievements, but the failure of their assumptions, the misallocation of their attention, and the inadequacy of their judgment, and I felt the satisfaction of watching them struggle to reconcile the reality with the narrative they had believed for so long. When it was finally my turn to walk across the stage, I carried myself with the calm confidence of someone who had not only survived a system rigged against her, but had quietly, methodically, and strategically transformed every obstacle into leverage. And as I shook hands with the dean and accepted the diploma that represented not only my academic accomplishments, but years of independent effort, I could see my parents' astonishment, a mix of pride, confusion, and discomfort that they could not entirely conceal, because they had invested in Jason with the certainty that he would be the one celebrated, and here I was, standing in front of everyone, having earned and constructed everything myself, a living, undeniable refutation of their priorities, and the realization that their assumptions were wrong, and that their favoritism had been a costly misjudgment, played out in real time, felt like the ultimate, satisfying triumph, a victory born not from spite, but from intelligence, patience, and unyielding self-determination. After the ceremony, I orchestrated the final piece of my plan, ensuring that the documentation of scholarships, internship acceptances, and professional endorsements I had collected over the years was shared in a subtle but public way that made it impossible for anyone to argue against my accomplishments, because my mentors and colleagues had been present. My evidence was verifiable, and the contrast between Jason's reliance on family support and my independent, relentless pursuit of success was clear for anyone paying attention. And as my parents and Jason attempted to digest the scope of what they had ignored for years, I allowed myself the briefest, quiet smile, not because I wanted to humiliate them unnecessarily, but because the truth had finally become visible, unavoidable, and undeniable, and in that clarity, the satisfaction of years of careful planning and strategic execution crystallized into a sense of triumph that no argument, denial, or defensiveness could diminish. That evening, as we returned home, I watched the subtle, unspoken recognition on my parents' faces as they tried to process the reality of my accomplishments, and I observed Jason's quiet discomfort, an unfamiliar humility that I had never seen in him before, and I understood that my victory was complete because it was measured not only in accolades or financial independence, but in the disruption of the narrative they had clung to, the collapse of assumptions they had long taken for granted, and the undeniable proof that their investment had been misallocated in ways they could no longer correct or explain. And in that moment, I felt the weight of all the years of effort, all the planning, all the restraint, and all the quiet intelligence converge into a single, perfect clarity. I had claimed my future entirely on my own terms, and the people who had underestimated me had no choice but to witness the brilliance of what I had built without their support. Finally, as I settled into the quiet of my apartment that night, Reviewing the events of the day and reflecting on the intricate orchestration that had led to this point, I recognized the ultimate truth that had driven every decision. Every calculated risk and every small, deliberate act of independence, I had transformed years of neglect and favoritism into the most potent form of vindication possible. And the knowledge that I had succeeded not only in spite of them, but without them, with absolute strategic brilliance and emotional intelligence, filled me with a sense of satisfaction so complete and irreversible that I knew the outcome would echo in their minds long after the ceremony, and in that understanding, I felt the calm, victorious certainty of someone who had not merely survived an unjust situation, but had entirely rewritten the rules of the game and emerged triumphant, unchallenged, and undeniably in control of her own destiny.